once again.
The midwife said some unintelligible words that reverberated throughout the room. Everyone cheered, and many had tears of joy in their eyes. They were hugging one another triumphantly. Meanwhile, Derek lay completely still in the midwife's arms. He looked at everything and everyone in the room, trying to assess the situation and how bad it could potentially get for him. Well, this is new. The woman in the bed must be my mother. That is, she's this baby's mother. He saw the bed was covered in blood, urine, and feces. She really needs a bath, he thought. He then took a look at the rough-looking, crying man by her side. I bet he's the father. I wonder if he's crying because he's happy I'm here, or because he's scared he almost lost his wife. I'm sure it's the latter, he thought bitterly. I'm sure I'm not an only child. I'm one more mouth to feed. A complication. As if in answer to his thoughts, a young boy and girl entered the room and rushed to hug the woman lying in the bed. Damn it, he thought. This is even worse than I imagined. I guess I only have two choices. Option 1, live with this family and fight for available resources. Starvation is a real possibility. And of course, once I grow up, I'll be forced to work, get married, have children, and lead a miserable life. Option 2, wait until I can move and grab a sharp object so I can put myself out of my misery and have another shot at reincarnation. Who knows, I might get a better life. Option 2 sounds like the winner. While Derek was lost in his thoughts, the room grew quieter. The midwife finished cleaning the baby and wrapping him up in a clean cloth. Everyone looked concerned. Derek didn't understand why until he remembered that he hadn't made a single sound. No crying. No laughing. Nothing. That was weird for a baby. His new mother made some remarks and tried to get up, ignoring her pain. The midwife shushed her, gently pushing her back to bed. She pointed to Derek, removed the cloth covering him, and gave him a soft spank to make him cry. Derek grunted in indignation. Do you want to play rough, old hag? He thought. Let's play then. You just activated my trap card. Twin flood incoming. Derek made a little sound and relieved both his bowels and bladder onto the midwife. The poop landed all over her feet while the urine covered her face and chest. Derek giggled loudly. The midwife was not amused. She said something while handing the baby to another woman to clean him. Derek couldn't stop giggling. He was proud of his work. After washing her face with warm water in a cloth, the midwife moved her left index finger and drew a circle in the air, striking it through in the middle from right to left. Then she pronounced a single word. Ekidu. Black light appeared on her fingertip. She pointed it over her wet dress and her shoes, making the feces and urine disappear alongside their smell. Derek was shocked, his mouth agape in surprise. He saw his work disappear and turn into dust. It was like watching those time-lapse videos in which a seed transformed into a flower in a matter of seconds. Merlin's beard. She's not just a midwife. She's also a real magician. I can't believe I'm seeing one in the flesh. Perhaps I was wrong, and this could be the best of my 3 lives, he thought, ecstatic. Derek has never been so happy. Not only because this world had magic, but also because, when he heard the word Ekidu, he felt something click inside of him. He could feel something taking root deep in his soul. Now he was ingrained in the very fabric of his new reality. He repeated the word obsessively inside his head and tried to recall every detail of the circular movement she'd made with her finger. The midwife approached the mother and said some words while putting her hands above her intimate parts. It was obvious the old woman was going to heal her. Is she going to do more magic? He thought happily. Show me, please, he said in his mind. The midwife spread her fingers wide and moved both arms in a circular motion, first up over her head. Then, she opened her arms as much as she could before joining her hands, palm against her backhand, at her navel's height.
Venire la cat.
Despite being all wrapped up, Derek attempted to mimic all of the midwife's movements, step by step, memorizing every single detail, no matter how small. A sphere of light covered Derek's mother's lower body, and she quickly recovered her health. Her pale skin became pink again, and all the traces of pain and exhaustion disappeared from her face. Derek could feel another click inside of him. First, there'd been the dark magic, but now he could feel a connection to light magic by simply hearing the power word. He could not stop grinning. If, and this is a big if, I have enough magical talent, I wouldn't have to live a life of misery, he thought. I could become a magician and live it up for the first time in my life. No shackles, no responsibilities, but it's better not to get my hopes up too much. With my luck, I'll end up completely untalented or... His train of thought was abruptly interrupted when he was handed over to his mother. She looked at him with concern while saying something to the midwife. Derek was sure she was worried about him, although he couldn't understand what she was saying. After his mother finished speaking, the mood in the room changed and everyone appeared gloomy. Derek was afraid he was responsible for this change. Eager to stay here and try to become a magician, he decided to play the part of a bouncing baby boy. He did his best baby impression. He giggled, smiled, and made cute sounds. The midwife, who went by Nana, felt a little hurt by Alina's obvious doubt in her abilities, but it wasn't the first time she'd dealt with an anxious mother. She'd known Alina since she was a child and had delivered all her babies. This had been one of the most difficult deliveries of her career. The labor had lasted for hours, and she'd been forced to cast healing spells multiple times to stop the bleeding. When she could finally see the baby's head, she'd known something was wrong. Alina was fighting with all her strength, but the baby was limp. So, Nana had to use her hands to pull out the baby as fast as she could, only to discover that he was being strangled by his own umbilical cord. After cutting and removing the umbilical cord, Nana had tried all of her best spells, but nothing had worked. For a terrible, long minute, Nana had believed the child was dead. But then, the healing light finally activated and made the baby puke, clearing his airway. Upon seeing him take a breath, Nana could finally relax. After all, healing magic couldn't do miracles. It could enhance a patient's life force, making it easier for them to recover from illness or injury. But it could not create life or cheat death.
He will be okay, won't he?
Alina asked.
He's so quiet. It's unnatural for a baby to be like that.
Nana understood that Alina didn't need a lesson in magic. She just wanted to be reassured about her child's health.
Worry not, my child,
she said.
I can prove to you that all is well with your baby.
Nana caressed Alina's cheek while giving her a warm smile. She took the infant from his mother's arms and removed his cloth as if she was revealing a treasure. She carefully adjusted the boy in the crook of her left arm, then circled her open right hand around him and said,
Venire ra tu.
A small wisp of light came out of her palm, dancing around the baby before going inside his chest. The light spread from head to toe, making him glow with a dim light.
See? If there was even a scratch on his body, my injury-detecting spell would leave that area blank. Your son is fine.
The burst of energy flowing through his body made Derek feel more powerful. In his old life, he rarely felt that. He felt powerful when he got his degrees, when he finally left his parents' home, and when he beat up bullies. However, the power and control he'd felt had been fleeting. Now it was different. More than adrenaline. Real magic, real power was coursing through every fiber of his being, making him feel invincible. So when the spell started disappearing, he wanted it to keep going.
No, come back to me. Give me back my power,
he thought. He focused on the last strands of energy, willing them to stay. He was unable to cast the spell on his own, but he could still feel its lingering effects. Derek's light stopped flickering. Instead, it grew stronger and stronger. The midwife appeared dumbfounded. Derek wanted it to last forever, but the exhaustion got to him, and he fell asleep. The light faded completely. Nana wrapped up the baby and returned him to his mother's embrace. Elena was confused and full of wonder.
"Nana, what was that?"
she asked. The old healer had no idea how to answer. Many possibilities popped up in her head, but they were complicated and would make Elena worry needlessly. It had been a long day, and she was eager to finish it. So, she borrowed a line from her childhood's favorite fairy tale.
"My child, I think the baby may be blessed by the light. There is no need to worry, only to rejoice."
Derek's first days as a baby were peaceful, but far from boring. He had no responsibilities. All he had to do was eat, sleep, poop, and do the occasional baby noise or finger-grabbing routine. That gave him all the time he needed to think about his future. On Earth, it was a fact that kids had greater learning potential than adults. His new family appeared human, or at least human-like, so he hoped this was all true in this new dimension. As far as he could tell, his body was no different than that of a baby from Earth. He could hear his heartbeat and see his chest moving with each breath he took. Even his genitals were exactly as he remembered them. His new family was perfectly human. If it wasn't for the existence of magic, he would have thought he had only traveled through time. But things weren't that simple. He decided to forget questions like what race he was now and other stuff like that. He didn't need to overthink things. One of the advantages of being a baby was that being ignorant was perfectly fine. Someone would teach him the way everything worked in due time. He focused on two priorities. Number one, learning the new language. All babies were supposed to learn their native language, and he had a limited time frame before people would worry that there was something wrong with him. He could not rest on his laurels. Priority number two was to somehow learn and figure out magic, or at least its foundations. He also had a deadline there since his learning potential would be at its peak during his growing years. After that, he would be no different from anyone else. Learning magic became his first priority. Being considered a slow learner was better than being forced to take another spin at reincarnation. Derek spent his first day in the new world alone in bed with his mother. His father slept in the boys' bedroom. He paid close attention whenever someone talked to him, trying to figure out common words or patterns. The rest of the time, unless he was eating or his cloth diaper was being changed, he tried to cast the three spells he knew: Ekitu, Venire Lactu, and Venire Ratu. Every attempt failed. He could not feel even an iota of power inside himself. From his days spent playing tabletop RPGs on Earth, he knew a little about magic. He knew words were a part of it. But there had been something more, or at least he hoped so. Otherwise, all of his efforts would be futile until he could learn to speak. With each passing failure, his anxiety grew stronger. Fear of the unknown and what that might bring started to build up. Also, getting used to pooping and wetting himself was no picnic either. Fortunately, his mother showered him with nothing but love and affection, making his day a little better. Despite his bias towards mothers due to his previous experience, Elena managed to make him feel safe and protected. It was a nice change of pace from his previous life. The final tally in his first day was 0 progress in magic and in learning the language. On the other hand, his mother seemed to be a good parent, and he at least learned his new name, Lith. The second day turned his world upside down. Elena, showing the strength of a wild ox, decided she was sick of resting and got up to help with the daily chores. Lith could finally see her in her entirety. Despite having given birth the previous day, she had a youthful and energetic look, typical of someone in her early 20s. Her body was strong, honed through years of hard work. Her long hair was a beautiful light brown tone, with shades of red all over it. The candlelight made it look like flames were dancing within her hair. Seeing her outside on a sunny day must be quite a sight, Lith thought. Maybe because he was still a baby, or because of the mother-son bond, Lith couldn't help but feel proud of her. He also discovered she dressed in simple clothes. Once she finished dressing, Elena wrapped Lith up, making it impossible for him to move. She placed him into her sash, using it like a baby cradle so she could easily hold him with one arm and minimum exertion. She walked out of the small bedroom and found her older daughter, Rena, messing with the fireplace. Elena went to her and spoke to her in a hiss, trying not to wake up the house. Lith couldn't understand what they were saying, but he could infer that Elena didn't want Rena anywhere near the fireplace. Still, Elena didn't seem mad. She smiled and ruffled Rena's hair. All was well, apparently. Elena shooed Rena away from the fireplace, and with a flick of her finger lit the firewood. "Infero!" Lith rejoiced. "Thank heavens," he thought. "I got that weird feeling that comes when I discover a new type of magic. This proves I wasn't imagining it." Elena said something to Rena, who went and opened the shutters to let in the light. Elena prepared breakfast. Elena took several vegetables out of a cabinet and chopped them with a knife. Some looked familiar to Lith, like potatoes and odd-colored carrots, but many looked completely foreign. The idea of that type of breakfast made Lith choke up. In his past life, he'd never liked vegetables, because he thought they were bland and unsavory. No matter how many he ate, he would be hungry again in half an hour. Elena shoved everything inside a small copper cauldron. She then hooked the cauldron and hung it on a metal bar over the fire. After that, she conjured water out of nowhere with a snap of her fingers and filled the cauldron. Both Lith and Rena were ecstatic, but for completely different reasons. For Lith, it meant hope. Spells could be cast without words or precise hand movements. That was proof that he had a real chance of practicing magic while still a baby. For Rena, it was a reason for pride. Magic was common, but every time Elena cast a spell, it was like watching a real mage at work. Rena said something to Elena with eyes full of admiration. Lith inferred she wanted to do magic just like her mom when she grew older. Elena replied to her with a kind smile and perceptive eyes, as if she knew that doing magic also required hard work. After a while, everyone woke up and they had breakfast together. The family consisted of Raz, the father, Elena, their 2 daughters, Rena and Tista, and 2 sons, Orpal and Trion. Rena, alongside her twin brother Orpal, was the eldest child. She was 6 years old and had blonde hair with shades of black. Lith was relieved that he didn't have to eat the vegetables since he was still nursing. While everyone ate, he took a look at his new house. From what he could see, it consisted of a big room, currently in use as a dining room, a kitchen with a pantry, and 3 doors that led to 3 bedrooms. Nothing else. A depressing thought occurred to him. There was no indoor bathroom. Breakfast was relatively quiet, so he had no problems learning the magic word for water when his father filled some jugs. Joran. After everyone finished and left for their daily routines, Elena took Lith and sat on a rocking chair. All morning, he discovered with great pleasure that in this new world, daily chores like washing dishes and cleaning floors were all performed using magic. From her rocking chair, Elena simply twirled her index and middle finger while reciting Presa, which produced up to 3 small whirlwinds that she moved all around the house to collect and get rid of dust. Whenever someone soiled the floor with dirt or mud, a flick of the wrist and the word Magna would send it back through the same door it came from. Lith was delighted to discover how common the use of magic was. Everyone in the family, including the younger ones, used magic to make their lives easier. When bedtime arrived, Lith was eager to try some magic. He was relieved when Elena finally unwrapped him. He had waited all day for his hands and feet to be finally free. Elena fell asleep almost instantly, yet Lith was too anxious and impatient to rest. After a full day of thinking, he decided to try only air magic, at least until he was confident enough in his ability to control it. Fire was too dangerous for a beginner, while water and light would easily wake up his mother. Lith could not spot any dirt to control in the dim light of the room, and he was too afraid to mess with dark magic until he got a better understanding of it. So, he twirled his little arm and said, Iya! Nothing happened. After countless failed attempts, Lith decided to give up. He didn't know how long his baby body would last before falling asleep. So instead of despairing, he started thinking. Magic was common in this world. Whenever he heard an elemental magic word for the first time, something would click inside him, as if creating a connection between him and the elemental energy. Those were all good news, but he still couldn't make heads or tails about why he kept failing. He never expected to succeed on the first try, but he had hoped that something would have manifested at this point. A tiny gust of wind, a spark of light, anything would do. He thought back to when the midwife had filled him with power. That feeling was not new to him, but he had never experienced it so intensely. Lith searched his memory until he found the answer. It was the same sensation that he had felt when he'd started practicing Aikido and learning basic breathing techniques in his previous life. Well, I have nothing to lose. Let's give it a try, he thought. Lith breathed in through his diaphragm, while relaxing his body to draw world energy in. Then, he held his breath for a few seconds to let the energy settle before breathing out and relaxing. Back on Earth, he had always thought that the intoxicating feeling he experienced during his first days of practice was just some kind of placebo effect. He'd believed he was deluding himself into thinking that the weak could miraculously become strong just by directing internal energy. But perhaps that hadn't worked because Earth's energy was too thin and fragile. Maybe this world was different. After some time, Lith felt a tingle all around his body. Then the energy seemed to move and condense inside his solar plexus. The more he performed the breathing technique, the clearer he could sense the energy stabilizing around him. In his old video games, the energy levels were always blue, so he visualized a blue sphere settling inside him. After a while, Lith felt like he was brimming with power. He held his breath one last time and twirled his little arm before commanding, "Iya!" He had aimed for the blanket, but the wind he produced went to his mother's hair, barely moving it. Still, he couldn't stop smiling. This is a great start, he thought. During the following weeks, Lith had a strict routine. During the day, while being all wrapped up, he focused on practicing the breathing technique and learning as much as he could about his family and their language. At night, he practiced magic until he fell asleep completely exhausted. He started over again as soon as he woke up and until Alina got up for the day. He tried taking breaks, but they never lasted long. He realized that contrary to popular belief, living as a baby was not as easy as it seemed, and he felt stressed most of the time. He could not speak, not even the words he'd already understood to avoid scaring his family. He could not move. He just observed, slept, ate, and relieved his bowels. He was not used to being so helpless and dependent on others for every little thing. Too much free time was making him insane. So he practiced and practiced, trying to adjust to his new reality without overthinking the absurdity of his situation. As his powers increased, so did his ability to control them. After a few weeks, he felt confident enough to try earth and water magic. He was always careful, never conjuring more than a few droplets of water or manipulating more than a handful of dirt. He discovered how to make the elements float in midair or change their shape and size by continuously feeding them energy. He shifted his night training to focus on control rather than power. His energy was very limited, and he preferred doing perfect but fewer elaborate tricks rather than many incomplete ones that could blow his cover. No matter how common magic was in this world, Lith knew that a baby doing it would be shocking and even terrifying. Lith was afraid that his family would abandon him, or worse, kill him. He was scared of death again because he had too much to lose. What were the odds of finding another world where magic existed, and being surrounded by a loving family? The chances were 0. He needed to play his cards well and as close to the chest as possible. Before revealing even a hint of his talent, he had to know how this world would react. How much talent was considered good? What was the line between being considered a genius and being labeled a monster? The only relief from all these worries was his constant training. After 3 months, he had become good enough at silent magic that he decided to try fire magic on the fireplace. The fire was already lit. While everyone was busy talking and having breakfast, he tried making the flames dance at will. It didn't work because the flames were too strong, and the distance between the table and the fireplace too big for his energy to have any effect. Still, he kept at it. He could sense the magic flowing from himself to the fireplace. It was a good training technique used to expand his energy range. The only downside to all this training was that he was constantly hungry. Luckily, he was still nursing, and Alina had no shortage of milk. The following month, Alina started weaning him. This event was meaningful for two reasons. The first was that he noticed food was in short supply in his household. Even with his limited vocabulary, he could read his parents' worried expressions every time they fed him. Despite being a cold-hearted, cynical misanthrope at his core, Lith couldn't help feeling guilty about it. They loved him as a son. At first, he thought they were no more than hosts. The only ones he cared about were Alina and his big sister, Rena, who also took care of him. But with their devoted love, affection, and constant care, the family had managed to make a dent in his hardened heart. The more time he spent with them, the more he considered them his real family, rather than people he was using for his own gain. He limited his training so he wouldn't exceed the amount of food they could afford. Even that required some fine-tuning to find the exact quantity, because eating too little would be as worrisome as eating too much. The other reason it was meaningful had to do with his physical body. Because he had to limit his training as much as possible, Lith now had more time to practice the breathing technique he called accumulation. That way, his core energy grew faster to the point it hit a bottleneck. His body wasn't big enough or strong enough to hold an indefinite amount of energy. Lith never noticed that before because his baby body grew rapidly, and he had only so much time to expand his energy core. Without him realizing it, his body and energy core had developed together. But the balance had been broken, and practicing accumulation made every fiber of his body ache, so he had to stop. Luckily, he was still well fed and rapidly growing, so despite not being able to train, the bottlenecks didn't last long. Another discovery was the result of him not practicing magic or using accumulation. While studying the causes of his bottleneck energy, he found out that it was possible to modify the breathing technique by skipping a step and not holding his breath. That way, the energy would just flow in and out of his body, renewing him like a good night's sleep. Lith named this technique invigoration. After several tries, he discovered that the world's energy allowed him to stay awake for several days, but not indefinitely. Each time he used invigoration, the energizing effect lasted less and less. Only sleeping reset its effectiveness. But the most important discovery, as usual, was made by complete coincidence. After adjusting his food intake, Lith's greatest enemy became hunger, but not the craving type that can be fixed by eating a candy bar or a piece of fruit. This was the type of hunger that never went away, always lurking, even right after he had had a meal. And even though he was not starving, it was a completely new experience for him. Even with all the misfortunes of his first life, food had never been an issue. He had always been able to eat to his heart's content, and he could even afford to be picky about his food. But now, he was so hungry that he ate every meal until the last scrap. If it had been allowed, he would have not hesitated to lick the plate clean. In the good days, when the portions were larger, the hunger was like white noise, annoying but easily ignored. During the bad days, though, either because the rations were smaller or because he practiced magic and consumed too much energy, the hunger would be unbearable. He would be so hungry sometimes that he experienced headaches all day long, often feeling lightheaded and incapable of focusing. He thought and dreamed restlessly about food. Of course, he was not the only hungry one in the family. His siblings Orpal and Rena were often tasked with feeding him. And while Rena had a big heart and strove to be like her mother, Orpal grew angrier and hungrier by the day. He often daydreamed of the days when he and his sister were the only children in the house. Now, Orpal not only had to fight each day for his parents' attention, but also for food and clothes. He used to have a room to himself, but now he had to share it with his other brother, Trion. And it was just a matter of time before Lith would come to take away what little personal space he had left. Orpal could not understand why a family as poor as his own would keep making kids. And it was the winter season, so there was not much work to be found. That meant food supplies were low and had to last until spring. It was the toughest time of the year for all farmers and their families because food had to be divided not only between the people, but also between their animals. Orpal was so sick of seeing Lith eat all the food that he started calling him Leech. So, whenever it was his turn to feed the little vermin, he would take some portions for himself. But Lith was not easily bullied. As soon as Lith noticed that the food was not coming toward him, he would cry his eyes out, and Alina would run to his side, foiling Orpal's plan. Lith never cried unless he needed to be fed or changed. Since he would never cry wolf, his parents took every wail seriously. That day was really bad for Lith. He was starving because of his growth spurt, and it was Orpal's turn to take care of him. Both their parents were out, tending to a cow who was suffering from frostbite. So Orpal took the plate full of creamy soup and gulped down a full spoonful. Lith immediately cried, but there was no one to hear him.
"Cry all you want, Leech,"
Orpal said. By now, Lith was able to understand most of the common words, including Orpal's mockery.
"Today is just you and me. No mom in shining armor to rescue you,"
he said, having another ration of the soup. Lith was going crazy from hunger. Once again, he was helpless. His magic was useless in his time of need. What could he do without blowing his cover? He thought about what options he had, but none came to mind. Using fire was too dangerous. A single meal was not worth it if he burned down the house. But his hunger was driving him mad. He felt a kind of rage he'd never thought possible.
"You bastard," he thought. "Feeling tough taking food from a baby?"
He saw Orpal going for another spoonful. His meal was already half gone. Lith's anger reached a new peak. His hatred burned like fire.
"You are not my brother,"
he thought with fury.
"You are nothing but a filthy thief. Complete and utter trash."
And then, instead of a click, he felt something break inside of him, like a dam that could not hold the raging waters any longer.
"I hope you choke on that spoon, you bastard!"
Lith shouted while waving his arm against Orpal. And then it happened. Lith felt the energy radiating from his body, reaching the spoon already in Orpal's mouth and pushing it down with fury. Orpal choked and, after removing the spoon from his throat, he puked everything he had. Lith was so astonished by his actions that he almost forgot about his rage and hunger. He had discovered something wonderful. A power no one else in his family seemed to have. Lith had discovered spirit magic. "Orpal," Alina said as her husband was too angry to speak. "From now on, Alina will be the only one feeding Lith. You can take all her shifts in the stable," Raz said to Orpal. "I don't think even you can eat hay." Orpal tried to defend himself, to no avail. He hated cows and the way they smelled. And that's not all. "Alina, prepare one more bowl for Lith and take it from Orpal's share. He must learn that his actions have consequences," Raz yelled. Lith didn't quite catch all the words his father had said, but he saw Orpal turning pale and smiled. It was good news for him. Orpal cried and apologized, but Lith cried harder, commanding the attention of his parents. Alina and Raz ignored Orpal's pleas and sent him to take care of the animals. After eating a generous amount of soup and milk, Lith was finally able to focus on what had happened. After days of experimenting, trying, and failing, he grasped the basics of his abilities and gained a deeper understanding of magic. Lith had discovered that to cast an elemental spell, he needed to go through a 3-step process. First, he produced core energy. Then he mixed it up with the world energy he was trying to manipulate. The final and hardest step was controlling the spell and its effects. However, spirit magic was different. It skipped the second step and only needed Lith's own energy. That made it more difficult than the common form of magic he'd practiced so far, and also it was more time and energy consuming. Spirit magic also required a lot more focus than common magic. Pure energy had no physical form, so he couldn't rely on his eyes to manipulate its effects. Everything depended on his willpower and imagination. The clearer the mental image he had in his head, the better the results. Spirit magic also had its drawbacks. For once, its range was very small, barely reaching a distance of a little over 3 feet. Despite its limitations, Lith only focused on practicing spirit magic. By doing so, he discovered that every time he improved his spirit magic technique, he also improved in all other types of magic. He didn't need to split his focus and practice them separately anymore, so his improvements became bigger and more noticeable than ever. From time to time, he used a random elemental spell to check on his progress, and he had reached a deeper understanding to that element's true nature. These improvements also made Lith's breathing techniques better. Through accumulation, he perceived how his energy core changed in size and expanded with each training session. Also, he had a rough visual of the amount of energy his body contained. By using accumulation, he fed the world energy to his core, allowing it to expand from the size of a pinhead to that of a glass marble. Once the energy core grew to the size of a marble, further progress was only achieved when the physical body compressed the core back to a pinhead. Lith had no idea how the phenomenon worked, and had no way to go around it. Energy core and body development had to go hand in hand. There were no shortcuts. Bottlenecks happened from time to time when Lith used accumulation while the energy core was still at its peak. The world energy would be rejected by his core, which would become out of control and damage his body. But by continuously training in expansion and compression cycles, his energy capacity was already miles ahead of the one he had when he was born. With spirit magic, Lith had better control of his internal and external energy. He also modified the invigoration technique so that when he breathed in the world energy, he combined it with his own and temporarily exceeded his own limits. Then he expanded the resulting energy, moving it from the solar plexus outwards until every part of his body was overflowing with energy. With invigoration, Lith also noticed many improvements in his body and immune system. For example, he rarely got sick and could resist extreme temperatures. When his whole family would catch a cold, he would either be better before the symptoms manifested or quickly recover in a few days. Improving invigoration is the only resource I have right now to temper my body, and I can use it as a crutch until I get big enough to do physical activity, he thought. Hopefully, it could also help me overcome my bottleneck periods faster. It's a gamble, but it's worth a shot. Besides, it's the only thing I can do as a 7-month-old baby. Moreover, his family life experienced some changes during the following months. After the soup incident with Orpal, a divide had opened between the brothers. Lith was vengeful by nature, and so was his brother. When he was angry, Orpal retorted by calling him Leech instead of Lith, Orpal's favorite nickname for him. But every time he said it out loud, it would cost him a serious scolding, and when he used it when arguing with his parents, he would also get a good spanking. Orpal blamed Lith for all of his misfortunes. The little runt always laughed when he was having a hard time. In contrast, the relationship between Lith and his parents kept getting better and better. He had already started babbling basic words, making sure to say mama when Alina embraced him and dada whenever Raz came near him. If this world is even remotely similar to the one on Earth, it would be better to stay on my old man's good side until I'm self-sufficient, he thought. He was still afraid of father figures, and the two of them had a distant relationship. Raz was always busy with something, so Lith spent most of his time with Alina and Reyna, who took good care of him. To be fair, Raz mistakenly thought that Lith was too little to notice his absence and lack of attention. He was sure that he would have time to create a close relationship when he got older, just like he had done with his other sons. Raz did love Lith, though, and was constantly amazed by him. He couldn't remember a time when he would cry for no reason, not even when Lith was teething. When Lith was asleep, or pretending to be, he would not make a sound or raise his voice at all. Lith was also very fond of Rena. She was more like a loving aunt than a sister to him. He could see himself in her, taking care of her little brother just like he did back on Earth with Carl. He would have loved to be more affectionate towards her, but all he could do was smile and laugh as soon as he saw her. He also called her Lala, the only one with a Babel name aside from his parents. It wasn't much, but it meant the world to Rena. Time went by. When he was 8 months old, Lith was put on the ground for the first time. He started crawling under strict supervision. When he was 9 months old, he started walking, and his babbling words became real ones. He was finally able to speak. On the day of his first birthday, something that also existed in this new world, he used simple phrases and made some questions to complete his vocabulary. Since he knew nothing about how babies behaved, it was very stressful finding the right time to do a thing or speak a new word. So, he resorted to cheating to find out the proper time to learn something. He already understood most of what he heard, but he was always open to new things. If Alina was eager for him to finally say mommy instead of mama, he waited a couple of days before making it happen. If Raz encouraged him to run towards him, he obliged. The hardest problem was paying attention to everything Raz, Rena, and Alina said while appearing completely oblivious to their words. Another issue was that once they let him roam free in the dining room, they also gave him small wooden toys and expected him to play and explore his surroundings. Lith already knew the dining room like the back of his hand. Still, he had to pretend to be curious and naive about it. That was the hardest thing he had ever attempted since reincarnating as a baby, and it scared him to death. He had no clue how a toddler would explore such a bland environment, and his paranoia about blowing his cover made him very anxious. Seeing the expectation in their eyes, he went to the nearest thing, the fireplace. The fire was not lit and the logs were cold and covered in ashes. When he reached out to touch them, Raz stopped him. This is the fireplace. Right now, it's safe, but fire is bad. Fire hurts. Never touch it, Raz told him. Lith looked at him, appearing confused, before trying to put his hand on the ashes. Raz grabbed it and pulled him away from the ashes. Fire is bad. Never touch it, he repeated. Lith stared into his father's eyes like he was deeply in thought before asking, Fire bad? Yes, very bad, Raz replied with a nod. Okay, Lith said and moved away from the fireplace. He went to the table and tried to climb up a chair, almost falling with it. Alina came to his rescue. Good gods, he sure likes danger, she said. Seeing their worried expressions, Lith thought of a way to end his torment. He kept putting himself in dangerous situations, like climbing on the table, or going into the kitchen and rummaging through the pots and knives. His parents quickly decided that his adventure time was over. They made him sit on an old piece of cloth and gave him toys to play with. And they finally relaxed a little. Lith had a little wooden horse, some kind of cart, and an odd-looking dog toy. Playing was much easier for him. He didn't need to create stories or explain what he was doing. He also used this time to practice spirit magic. He didn't use his hands to move the toys, instead making them float as close as possible to his fingers to give the appearance he was touching them. Lith enjoyed those moments. He was finally able to rejoice, scream, and laugh any time he made a new discovery or breakthrough in spirit magic, and all his parents saw was a happy child playing with his toys. Who would have ever thought that such a quiet little fellow could have such a vivid imagination? Raz said proudly. Look at him. All he has is just some toys, yet it looks like he has the whole world in the palm of his hand. The following years weren't easy for Lith. He was finally able to ask plenty of questions, filling most of the holes in his vocabulary and learning about his family in the new world. He learned that the village where they lived was called Lutia, which belonged to the country of Lustria, itself a part of the Griffin Kingdom. His parents knew the names of the neighboring countries, but didn't care about the world outside their village. In their eyes, the king was a distant and mythical figure, and the real person of authority was Count Lark. He was the only one that administered justice, collected taxes, and was in charge of the village's affairs. He was also the guest of honor at Lutia's Spring Festival. Lith's parents never talked to him or his siblings about magic, wars, or general history. The only stories they told them were bedtime stories. All their fables were filled with beautiful princesses, valiant heroes, and villainous tyrants. Lith was very dissatisfied with the lack of information. He wanted to know more, like the name of the planet that they lived on, or what level of scientific development this society had. He also wanted to learn about the history of magic, the lore, the legends, and anything that could give him a clue of what to expect from his new life. Unfortunately, it was clear that his parents knew very little about these matters. And worst of all, he wasn't even supposed to ask these kind of questions or even think about them. At least his origins were easy to understand. His parents had married at the age of 16, early even by the village's standards. Raz was an only child and he inherited his father's farm, which was their current home. Elena got pregnant shortly after the marriage with the twins, Orpal and Rena. She got pregnant every 2 years thereafter. This meant that Raz and Elena were currently 25 years old, Orpal and Rena were 8, Trion was 6, Tista was 4, and finally, Lith was 2 years old. Most of this information came from questions his siblings asked their parents. Lith was limited to questions like, "What's this? Why's that?" and so on. By spending more time with the rest of his family, Lith discovered the reason why, despite them having a nice farm with its own barn and henhouse, they struggled to put food on the table. Tista had been born with a congenital condition that prevented her from doing any type of physical activity and also made her prone to illness. Short runs were enough to leave her out of breath. She also had bouts of coughs from time to time, which became serious when she fell sick. At that point, Elena or Raz would have to run to the village to fetch the midwife, who Lith learned was called Nana, so she could tend to Tista. There was no cure for her condition, so the only thing Nana could do was alleviate her symptoms and return Tista to her previous state. However, the treatment was very expensive, and Nana charged extra for home visits, even if Raz went to the village to pick her up and then bring her back home. She argued that when she did home visits, she'd lose business in the village, so she demanded more compensation. It was the constant treatments and Nana's visits that put a big strain on the family's budget. Lith felt sorry for his sister. Despite not spending a lot of time with Tista, she meant a lot to both Elena and Rena. So that was enough for him to care about her as well. He felt helpless and cursed his inability to perform light and dark magic. Light magic required a patient, and Tista was the ideal candidate. But until he had a solid grasp on how it worked and learned more about the human anatomy in this world, he didn't dare put anyone at risk. Dark magic was another story. Lith had only seen it once, and no one in his family used it. The only time he saw it, he clearly felt its destructive power. He was also biased towards it because, back on Earth, dark magic was always associated with evil practices and conjuring undead creatures, so he had no desire in learning something with potentially horrifying effects. Lith could only keep on living, hoping that eventually he'd get some magic training that would allow him to help out. In the meantime, he was getting used to his new family life. Every day was a careful balance. He had to be lively and curious, but not too much. He could run around the house, but never go outside. His parents were very demanding and hard to figure out. If he tried to sit at a corner to meditate, they worried because they thought that he was too quiet or too lazy. If he moved around or tried to help them, he was scolded for getting in the way. They also refused to teach him chore magic, the term they used for the lesser spells they used in their daily life, and forbade him from learning them. Lith could not go outside without a chaperone, he could not go near the fireplace, and he could not ask too many questions. Everything was forbidden until he grew up. More than once, Lith wanted to scream that although he looked young, he was actually the oldest one there, but all he could do was suck it up and obey. Furthermore, his feud with Orpal was still ongoing, and now he also felt his brother Trion's hostility towards him, which was clearly influenced by Orpal. It was obvious that Trion saw Orpal as a role model, the same way Lith saw Rena. Unlike Orpal, though, Trion didn't ignore him completely, even when their parents were absent. But Lith could feel that every time his brother helped him, it was only out of politeness. There was no kindness between them. In return, Lith started to ignore him. "I already spent half of my old life dealing with dysfunctional family members.
I'm done with that. If you want to be a jerk, so be it. I don't give a damn about you, he thought with bitterness. By the time he was 3 years old, he couldn't take it anymore, and winter made things worse. Not only was he stuck at home all the time, but the boredom and hunger were pushing him to his limits. It was a stormy afternoon, and the family had gathered around the fireplace. Helena was teaching her daughters how to sew, while Raz was teaching Orpal how to carve wood. Treon and Lith were only allowed to watch. They were too little to handle sharp objects, and even sewing was off limits. Lith knew this because he had asked his mother if he could learn, which baffled Raz as that was usually a task reserved for girls. Helena was flattered, but she refused because she said that his hands were too small and clumsy. And she was right. Lith's body felt even clumsier than the one he had before he had started practicing martial arts. Just thinking about how much muscle he had lost was enough to make him cry. So he patiently waited until Raz finished teaching Orpal, and, mustering all his courage, he asked his father if he would teach him how to read, write, and do basic math. Raz was flabbergasted by the request. "You're too young. Kids learn these things when they are 6 years old and can go to school. I think you'll get bored if I start teaching you right now," he told the truth. That's how he had been raised and what all the men in his family believed. But Lith didn't budge. "What could possibly be more boring than sitting here doing nothing? Please, Daddy, try me. I beg you, please, please, please." Raz didn't know how to refuse. Lith had never asked for anything before. Even when he's still hungry, Lith never asks for more food when he sees that there are no more rations, Raz thought. He's so unlike Orpal. I don't know if Lith's just too good, or if I'm spoiling Orpal too much. Raz still wanted a way out, but Helena gave him a pointed stare. Her hands were still sewing, and she stopped correcting the girl's technique, but her eyes clearly conveyed the message. Still, Raz was adamant about not wanting to teach Lith. He thought of ways out, but realized that learning didn't even require using dangerous tools. That gave him an idea. Raz looked into Lith's puppy eyes, feeling bad, but still going through with his plan. "I'm sorry, son. We have nothing where you could ride on, so I can't teach you," he said. Lith was a step ahead and had considered all options before asking. He picked the biggest tray they had and filled it with the ashes stored in a bucket beside the fireplace. "Yes, we do. We can ride as much as we want," Lith said. Raz was amazed by Lith's ingenuity, and so was Helena. Still, Raz was about to object again when he saw that his wife's stare had turned into a frown. Her hands were moving very fast as she sewed, and that meant he was in trouble. A storm was happening outside, so he could not run away from the one brewing inside. The only course of action was to admit defeat and yield. "Which one do you want to start with?" he asked Lith. Raz could only hope that his son would get bored quickly and let him be at peace. "Math," Lith replied. So Raz sat on the floor beside him and started drawing lines in the ash. Lith was ecstatic. The numbers they used had a different shape from the Arabic numbers he used on Earth. But that was the only difference. Even the calculation methods were the same. Lith kept the new numbers in the upper row to learn their shape, and then started doing the multiplication tables. He was able to do simple math, but he needed to memorize the new numbers and knew them by heart. Once he did it, Lith took requests from the family members, and when Orpal sarcastically asked how much was 124 times 11, Lith quickly replied that it was 1,364 and left them speechless. Helena could not help herself, and she proudly lifted Lith and gave him a big hug. "My little genius!" she exclaimed. In less than 1 hour, he mastered what usually took 1 full year to do. Rena and Tista joined in on the embrace, congratulating their little brother, while the male side of the family was still shocked. In rural areas, people only learned the basics to avoid getting ripped off when they sold or bought merchandise. That's why they only learned addition and subtraction, and didn't pay much attention to things like multiplication and division. Reading and writing required more time, but they were still simple enough to master. Lith already knew most of the words and how to spell them. He only needed to learn the alphabet and memorize it to be able to read and write. Once again, his family was proud of him, and the only one not rejoicing with them was Orpal, who was left alone full of envy and anger.